morning. Good. Parshas Mishpatim. Parshas Mishpatim, you can page on 5. You can find on page 416 in the art scroll. It is a portion that is placed immediately following the first part of the description of the events that occurred at Sinai during the revelation. Towards the end of the portion, the section continues with events that are occurring during the revelation at Sinai. There is a dispute among the rabbis how to read the last few verses of this week's portion that describe Moshe making his way through a cloud into the mountain. It is unclear if the text is describing events leading to the revelation, so it would place them before Kabbalat HaTorah, before what we call Kabbalat HaTorah, or perhaps these are events that are describing what occurs afterwards, because we know that after they experience the revelation, for a period of 40 days, Moshe is on the top of the mountain. So he obviously makes his way to the top of the mountain. So perhaps what is being described at the end of this week's portion is Moshe making his way to the top of the mountain. Sandwiched in between these descriptions, or on page 416, sandwiched in between the description that we read last week and that which will be read at the end of this week's portion, we have Parashat Mishpatim, the bulk of this week's portion, which is the civil law. Civil law. You cause damages to others, you interact with others, there are responsibilities there, obviously to tell us that do not view our religion as a spiritual experience. Do not, God forbid, believe that you practice your Judaism only in the synagogue or in the study hall or perhaps at home, but in the marketplace it's a free-for-all because business is business. That's not what Judaism is about, but rather you have a responsibility in the marketplace just as much as you have, or perhaps in many cases even more than in the study hall. That's the essence of what is being taught, and these are the first laws that are presented to the people of Israel after Revelation. It doesn't start off right after Revelation by telling us how much matzah you have to eat, or it doesn't start off by telling us, when it comes to the laws of your esrog, how big it has to be. No, it starts off with the way you are going to interact with others in the marketplace. Now, we know very well that we have a responsibility towards the human race, but we have more of a responsibility for our own people. And that is very normal. There's nothing unethical there. And actually, the world is a better place when people take care of their own clan. In other words, if really the Chinese take care of the Chinese, and the Muslims take care of the Muslims, and Arab leaders are really concerned for their people, the world would actually be a decent place. I mean, think of the crisis in the Middle East as it's known, or take even what the world calls the Palestinian territories. Why are there issues there? Well, there are issues there because you have people who couldn't care less about their own people. Right? Saddam Hussein, his ego is more important than 100,000 teenage soldiers going to war. Right? That's the way you work. It's about me. It's not about my people. That brings about destruction. In Yiddishkeit, we always teach you have a responsibility towards all humans because they are all created in the image of God. Let's start off with your own people. And even when it comes to the laws of charity, tzedakah, right? You want to give charity. There are local needs and there are needs somewhere in the United States, right? Where does your responsibility begin? Aniyei Ircha Kodmim. And that's logical because you interact with them. God placed you there. You recognize the need. Take care of that local need. And so too when it comes to family, when there is your family's needs come first. Very logical. And therefore, when we're going to go ahead and read in this legal system, in the civil law presented in this text, that there are things that are perhaps acceptable with, and as they relate to your interactions with others, but they are not acceptable to the members of your faith. We don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem that Judaism tells me that it is fine to charge interest to a loan made to a non-Jew, but if I lend another Jew, so then I shouldn't be charging interest. Right? Now we know the history of how it evolved and how there's something known as a heter iska, and it's something that was a necessity due to the realities that were in the Middle Ages. We recognize that. But we have no challenge, no difficulty with the text because we understand very well my responsibility to the members of my community, right? And it could be, a responsibility. We obviously agree that if there are people that are members of your shul, for example, there's more of a responsibility. The rabbi should be listening on the phone to someone for 45 minutes if they are a member, right? But if they are perhaps someone that's not living here, perhaps the rabbi has the right to say after 44 minutes that, for the third time, I don't know if I could really help you with this issue, perhaps for someone else. We understand that that's logical. This is what we understand, and this is something we have to appreciate as we enter into the discussion of this week's portion, specifically the first law, and think about it. This is finally when God is giving us the details. It's always like that. There's the big event, and then there are the details. Last week we read about the big event. Big events often collapse and don't work well. Because like last week's portion, there was a big event when Moshe Rabbeinu, they hear the voice of God. Moshe comes down with those tablets. It didn't work well, as we shall see. The Shashtil, the event that wasn't as big, worked a little bit better. It lasted much longer. So we finished with the big event. Now it's time for the details. It's all in the details. So now, obviously, those first laws that are going to be presented in the details are very significant ones. Which ones are going to be presented? The laws of the Hebrew slave. Now I add the word Hebrew because as you read through this portion and you read other sections of the Torah, there are two types of slaves, and that's what they were, slaves. Described, you could try to find a more politically correct term, but the reality is these are two types of slaveries that existed in the past. There are laws and regulations that relate to each one, but they are different. The first slave described is the Hebrew slave. The Hebrew slave, we are told, is a slave that works for you. How did he land up becoming a Hebrew slave? Well, there are two ways it could occur. One is if it's an individual that stole property from others, destroyed it, consumed it, and he has absolutely no way of paying up. And this is before the invention of credit cards. Today you just put it on the credit card and move on. But rather, he has a responsibility to pay up. What does he do? So the court has a mechanism known as the Eved Ivri. They could sell him as a slave. So if he stole property worth $4,000, and it's an individual that he's worth on the market $2,000 a year, for 2 years he is considered a Hebrew slave. Option number one. Option number two is a person who simply doesn't like the freedom he has, doesn't like the idea that he's making choices for himself, and he feels far more comfortable being either associated or working by someone. And he, what the rabbis call mocheret atzmo, he sells himself. So these are two ways that we land up with an Eved Ivri. And what does the text tell us? The text is going to tell us that this is indeed something that is approved, but it is something that is not desired by God. It is not an ideal. And the way we know it's not an ideal, because the text number 1 tells us, be sure to release him. There is no such thing as a 7-year contract with an Eved Ivri. By the 7th year he shall be released, because he must know that we are servants of a creator. To serve another human being is simply something that's not desirable. The system existed at the time. The Torah, quite often, as we'll see, works with what exists in reality, but it's obviously not approved. So therefore, let's turn to the text to introduce the first one. Verse 2, Ki tikne eved ivri, when you purchase the Jewish slave, art scroll, bondsman, fine. Shesh shanim yavod, you should work for 6 years, but on the 6th, he should go out with no charge. Now, we are told here that he can actually have a wife. What does that mean? The rabbis tell us that due to the fact that he sells himself, he could work for the master by producing, by fathering children through a Knaani maidservant. That is presented in verse 3. Now, let's continue here. Verse 5. Verse 5 is describing the release time. He reaches year 7. It's time for him to be released. So you would imagine a guy has been a slave, right? There have been wars to release slaves. Finally, he is reaching that point he's been waiting for. He's gained freedom, a big party. But listen to what the slave is going to say in verse 5, which is a clear indication that there are great responsibilities here for the master. Because in verse 5 he says, Ve'im amor yomar ha'eved. And if the slave says, you know what? Ahafti et adoni, I love my master. The wife that was presented to me during this period of time. Lo etzeh chofshi, I shall not go free. Now, the rabbis tell us that it is natural for some people to make such statements because during that period of time that he worked for his master, the master has to treat him with decency. There is actually a statement in the Jerusalem Talmud that if, for example, the master eats high-quality bread, he has the responsibility of giving such bread to the servant, to the slave as well. The master gets good coffee, he can't buy cheap coffee, instant, for the slave. And the Yerushalmi continues that if he only has one pillow, he's not allowed to use it, but rather he must give it to the Hebrew slave. Clearly what we are being told here is, yes, the system exists, but you have responsibility to treat him with dignity. Quite often people who have not been treated with dignity, and they enter into a household where they're given the dignity, they don't want to leave. Well, the Torah says this is not what I want. I want you to be a free person. Take charge of your life. And therefore, to convey that message, they place this individual, in verse 6, in front of the door, and they go ahead and they took the awl to make the hole through his ear. And the message, of course, is, as the rabbis tell us, we gained our freedom by the doorposts when we were in Egypt. When God passes over the houses that had blood on the doorposts. The ear heard at Har Sinai the voice of God declaring that we are to be servants of the Creator. This is a person that didn't get this message. And therefore, we have this ceremony, this experience here. And he remains a slave until the Jubilee, until the Yovel. This is what is being presented here. Now, the other slave, is one that there are a few details that are described in the Torah about what we call category 2, Eved Knaani, and a slave that is not a Hebrew, but rather he becomes like property. You have the right, and perhaps in some situations the obligation, of holding on to him and not freeing him. And even after the passing of the individual, he remains part of the property of the household. He is inherited, he or she is inherited by the children. Nevertheless, there are guidelines. And the Torah tells us that if a person strikes such slave, the non-Jewish slave, and injures the individual, and knocks out an eye or a tooth, the man is free. Now this is a concept that if you study the laws and regulations, if any of them did exist indeed 3,500 years ago, this was shocking, because this is basically indicating you have a responsibility how you treat this individual. Okay? He is another human being. This is not just property. So those are the two categories that exist regarding slaves. Fine. We are introduced to this concept. But why is this the first law presented after their revelation? So some would say, well, it's to address the fact that Judaism is all about seeing the other as another person, not just as an extension of your property. Treat the other not as someone that is there to serve you, but as another human being. Fine. But there's obviously more to it, and for that you have to turn to the Haftorah. And to turn to the Haftorah, you're going to have to, in the Art Scrolls on page 1156. And the Haftorah itself, it's talking about a period. It's from the book of Yirmiyah. So it's not going to be pleasant. You have to deal with challenging situations at the time. And anytime we turn to the book of Yirmiyah, we know that we're going to have to listen to unpleasant remarks, because the society at the time was quite problematic. And we're dealing here with the last years, the last decade of Jerusalem before the destruction of the first temple, the first Beit HaMikdash. And there is a king by the name of Tzidkiyahu, a weak king, because there is a superpower around the corner that is controlling, manipulating, and at sometimes even conquering cities all around. So there's a mode of panic, but Tzidkiyahu does not have the power to lead the people the way he should. And it seems to be that there was an issue that existed at the time, that there were slaves, now listen carefully, there were many Hebrew slaves. The upper class mistreated the masses. The upper class benefited from cheap labor, benefited from the fact that they basically own others, and therefore the concept of the Torah that you release a Hebrew slave after 7 years didn't seem too desirable for them. You know, you ever have like a good work, a person that helps at home that is actually very, very good, knows where everything picks up after some time, milchiks and fleishiks, right? And they do things exactly as you want it, and they clean with passion, and then you are informed as they get it, right? It took 3 months. They finally understand exactly what has to be done, and then they inform you, I'm leaving. I'm going back to my country, or I got a better job, near Lawrence, whatever it is. They tell you such a thing. So how do you feel, right? So the first thing you do is you want to offer them a little bit more, because you believe that that's the way you're going to have the help. It's painful. Well, this is what's happening in Jerusalem at that time. The upper class, right, the sarim, the people who were close to the royal court, they basically control other people. But politically there's a challenge there, because at that time, when you have an army coming to attack, or perhaps even the potential of an army, like the Babylonian army coming to attack, the concern of the leaders is that you're going to have a rebellion from within, that the masses are going to say to themselves, why should I fight to keep our quote-unquote independence when I, as an individual, is lacking that? Why should I? So therefore, what did they do? They make a big ceremony. And the big ceremony was to free all the Hebrew slaves. The idea behind it was to give them the satisfaction that they have gained their freedom. And obviously, right afterwards, they're going to go ahead and hand them a weapon and say, now please join us to fight for our independence. This is what's occurring there. And if you look in the beginning of the Haftarah, on page 1156, verse 8 of chapter 34, Hadavar asher haya Yirmiyahu me'et Hashem. These are the words that came to Yirmiyahu. Acharei, and this is occurring after Kerot HaMelech Tzidkiyahu. This is after this covenant, this brit. Et kol ha'am asher beYerushalayim. There was this wonderful covenant that occurred, and covenants were done by taking an animal and slicing them in two. That was the symbolic way of having a covenant. A covenant is taking place. Likro lahem deror, to go ahead and proclaim their freedom. And what was the proclamation in verse 9? L'shaleach ish et avdo, that every man will set free his bondsman, his slave, ve'ish et shivchato, and the maidservant, and the bondswoman. Ha'ivri ve'avriya chofshim, because just as there is an eved ivri, there is an eved ivriya. The details are perhaps, there are some differences between the two, but the concept is the same. Lebilti avod, and this ceremony, this covenant, was that no man should enslave his fellow Jew. Ish lo avod bam b'Yehudi achiyahu ish. In other words, that a person should not, achihu ish, we should not be enslaving one another. And in verse 10, by the way, this was a successful event. Vayishma'u kol asarim v'cholam. Everyone, the leaders, the entire people, they followed this covenant. And what did they do? Asher ba'u b'brit l'shaleach ish et avdo ve'ish et shivchato chavshim. They sent them all free. Lebilti avod bam od vayishma'u vayishalechu. And they did send them free. Good news, right? We're talking about Jerusalem in the days of the prophet Yirmiyah, when everything you expect to be negative, everyone doing everything wrong. And you read this text now and you're ready to start clapping that finally they did something right and they do it with the covenant. Verse 11. Vayashuvu achareken, but after that, Vayashivu et havadim et hashfachot. Didn't last long, right? They got back home and they see the sink full of dishes and they see a wall that the construction was not completed. They said, you know what? This is not such a good idea, right? Asher shilchu chovshim. So what do? Vaychbeshum la'avadim u'lishvachot. They get them back. This is Jerusalem at that time. So the prophet Yirmiyahu has to come in. And he tells them, now obviously you have to understand that politically it seemed to be that the times changed. The concern of Nebuchadnezzar's army coming and thus needing these freemen to join the army was no longer necessary. So what do? You bring them back into the family. So here comes Yirmiyahu Navi. Vayehi devar Hashem el Yirmiyahu met Hashem lemor. So Yirmiyahu comes in verse 13. Ko amar Hashem. So said Hashem, the God of Israel. Anochi, listen, God says, I karati brit et avotechem. I went and that I sealed a covenant with your forefathers. Biyom, on the day, hotzii otam me'eretz Mitzrayim, on the day I took them out of the land of Egypt. Mi bet avadim le'emor. I said to them on that day, and I gave them regulations. Miketz sheva shanim, that after 7 years, tishalchu ish et achiv ha'ivri, you should send them away. Okay, and you guys did the right thing. Verse 15. Vatashuvu atem hayon. You did the right thing. You freed everyone. But then in verse 16, you go ahead and you reversed yourself. Verse 17, guess what? You didn't listen to the commandment of the Torah to proclaim freedom. So now I will make you free, meaning I will proclaim you to be free, and therefore the nations of the world, the plagues, the animals, the warriors are going to tear you apart. And then we get into the typical descriptions that you would expect during that period of time. Okay? That's what we have so far. Commentators wonder, if you look carefully, we are told that Yirmiyahu Hanavi tells the people of Israel that I made that commandment on the day, in verse 13, Biyom hotzi otam me'eretz Mitzrayim. On that day. So there's a statement in the Jerusalem Talmud, a rabbi by the name of Shmuel bar Rabbi Yitzchak, and this rabbi says that actually, as the people of Israel on that day are experiencing their freedom, already then they are commanded that you should know that when the day comes that you will have Hebrew slaves, remember that you must free them after 7 years. Wonder the commentators, why were they informed? This wasn't relevant for them at that time. As they are leaving Egypt, what they have is perhaps matzah maror, but they don't have slaves yet. Why were they commanded at that time to release slaves? So they explain that you should know it is very difficult to release a slave. Now, we want the people of Israel to be mindful of their responsibility. And therefore, the people of Israel are told at a time that they recognize the experience of freedom. Meaning in Judaism, it is quite often that you have to channel your emotions in the proper way. If you have an emotion, if you feel, for example, pain, always we talk about doing chesed, doing kindness. But to do kindness, you have to identify the needs of the individual who's on the receiving end. Now, if it is someone that has difficulty with finances, so you have to identify their need and go ahead and give them and tailor your giving based on what is needed. What if you're supposed to give someone not financial assistance, but emotional assistance? So obviously, the more you recognize, the more you understand the person who is going through that difficulty, the better you could go ahead and turn around and perform an act of kindness. We know very well that if a person, Lo'aleinu, is going through an illness, the greatest kindness a person could do is to go ahead and find someone else who went through that experience and was able to overcome. And that's what a support group is. That you should know you're going through difficulty now, but so-and-so, or even better, the person themselves who went through it could come and say, listen, I went through that challenge, I know what it is, but look, I was able to overcome. And suddenly, you could take that experience, the painful experience of the past, and use it as a tool to assist someone and help them assist them in pulling through the difficulty. Right? That's a reality. When you understand and you could turn to the person and say, I know what you are going through, I went through it, but look, I was able to overcome. So in Judaism, we are very much focused on this idea of channeling the emotion. And therefore, the commentators explain that the people of Israel, as they are leaving Egypt, they know very well what the feeling of freedom is about. They know what it's about. So therefore, it is the appropriate time to command them and tell them, listen, right now, as you feel elated, you feel so happy that you have your freedom, remember that in the future, channel that emotion and use it towards others to grant them freedom. And therefore, the text tells us that you have to free them biyom hotzi'i otam. In other words, when were they commanded? Yirmiyahu Hanavi tells them, you as a nation, you were commanded on that day when you sensed that feeling, you were told to turn around and utilize that emotion to do good towards others. This is what is explained regarding the Haftarah. But suddenly we gain some clarity why this is the first commandment after Revelation, because this is the first commandment as a nation. As a nation, we are always, our identity at the time is we just left Egypt. This is several weeks later. We are being told, use that experience you went through. Use those emotions to turn around and do good in the future. This is what we are being told. Now, in 1860, in the United States of America, there was great fear at the time, and there was serious concern. This is actually towards the end of 1860, the beginning of 1861. The United States of America at the time just elected a new president, and his name was Abraham Lincoln. And the lame duck president, President Buchanan, was in panic mode because a few of the states of the South were threatening to secede from the Union. This was a serious concern. And believe it or not, that at some point in December of 1860, he declared that we should have a fast day, a day of prayer. I don't see Obama having any success. I mean, his wife is trying to monitor the diets of the African American communities that they eat healthier food. And I don't know how successful she is, but this is occurring in the United States of America at that time. And the question was secession. The question was basically, as you know, the South, they're producing cotton there. You're producing cotton, so you need labor. You need labor. You have slaves, and slavery was something that was the norm at that time. The North, on the other hand, there are cities there. they evolve, obviously they are affected more by the way of thought that's occurring in Europe, and therefore for them this is something that's not ethical. So there was a status quo for many, many decades, that in the South slavery is acceptable, in the North not. Obviously Canada played its role in the underground railway, where they would bring the free men here. This is what was functioning in the United States, and status quo works well until there is what's known as the Louisiana Purchase, where they start purchasing, where the United States has this massive expansion planned to the west. And then there is a shaila, these new territories, what's going to be the halacha there? What are they going to consider it? Is slavery going to be legal or illegal there? And the South feels very much that if they're going to go ahead and outlaw it there, who knows what's next, a slippery slope. So therefore the South threatens that if they go ahead and indeed prohibit slavery there, they're going to secede. Abraham Lincoln makes it clear that that is what he is going to do, and they are threatening to tear apart the United States of America. Fine. At that time, there are not too many Jews in the United States. The majority of the Jews arriving on these shores, as we all know, occur after 1880, when the pogroms start in Russia. And then we haven't stopped coming since then, 1880. So when you talk about the Lower East Side in New York, and you hear of all, from the Al Jolson to all the other, the Jewish flavor that was brought to America, our contribution from bagels to entertainment to music, right? From Gershwin to Mayer Brothers, all these contributions that you talk about in the United States of America, this is all occurring after 1880. So who's there prior to 1880? So there are many, many German Jews. German Jews are there, a few of them from England as well. And there was already a Reform presence. There was also an Orthodox presence at the time. Among rabbis, there were rabbis in the United States. Rabbis were actually scholars, Torah scholars, Talmidei Chachamim. Rabbis that now in the United States of America there are, and Canada together, North America, there are thousands of such rabbis, thousands upon thousands. I'm sure the number of Talmidei Chachamim, Torah scholars in North America, the number is obviously more than 10,000. The number at the time, and I've read this from sources who were addressing the existence in the Americas, were 3. Meaning there were other Orthodox rabbis, but some of them were more like chazonim, who would come to the Americas, and if they would ask them, can you read the Kaddish? Yeah, of course. You could sing. Oh, you could be a rabbi for us. For the Americas, that is good enough, right? They weren't getting complex halachic shilas and the laws of ribbis. They were getting some basic requirements for funerals. This is the Americas that existed in the 1850s. So 2 of the rabbis at the time, 2 of the Orthodox rabbis at the time, were giving sermons in 1860 that related to the crisis of the America, the crisis of slavery. And they're not addressing so much slavery, but rather they are addressing secession. Is it okay to secede from the Union? Is it ethical? So it is interesting to read the words of these rabbis. And one of the rabbis is a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Morris Raphael, who was the rabbi in Bnei Yeshurun in Manhattan. Bnei Yeshurun, if I'm not mistaken, it's still around there. Bnei Yeshurun in Manhattan. And he's giving a sermon in 1860. And, he talks about, as a rabbi, the fact that slavery itself did exist in the past, right? So the attitude, he mentions that he has a problem with how slavery has manifested itself in the South, because the stories that reached the North were obviously those of people who mistreated the slaves. It wasn't all so, by the way, as you can imagine. There were many of them in the South that were quite happy working for their masters because they were treated in a decent way. Many of them were mistreated, and the brutality that you read about obviously represents a reality as well. It's interesting that when we were in Memphis and we talked about the Civil War, so they would tell me that here in the South we don't call it the Civil War. It was known as the War of Northern Aggression. That's how they call it in the South. Okay, and this is a few years after 1860. And the realities are that in the United States of America has not. There's still some, when you talk about the southern states, Republican, all these things are indicate that there are still some feelings that have not vanished. So Rabbi Morris Raphael addresses the issue of slavery, presents what he believed to be the Torah view of what is occurring, and he notes these are difficult times. There's nothing quite fascinating in his work. Another rabbi, and the second rabbi is one of the three Torah scholars in North America. His name was Rabbi Bernard Ilui. Rabbi Ilui studied as a young man under the great Chassam Sofer. He studies under the Chassam Sofer in Preshburg. At some point gets a university degree, and in some circles like to call it a decree. And he makes his way eventually to the United States of America, and he has rabbinic positions. I don't think I'll remember all the cities because he even beat us in our travels, because he was in Baltimore, St. Louis, New York, New Orleans, and eventually Cincinnati. Okay, he traveled. And he, at the time, took a position, and he sided with the South. The only rabbi who actually said that what is occurring in the North, it is indeed an aggression, to go ahead and to come with their great values and cause starvation, because that was actually the result. If you're going to go ahead and take away their labor, how are the people in the South going to survive? So he sided with the South. And there were a few interesting things in his statement. These are sermons that are published. Number one, he notes that today there is a question about slavery. Is it ethical? And he notes that it's fascinating how the times are changing, because 50 years ago, no one would have even asked that question. This is something that he notes. Like, it's incredible that people even ask these questions. And then he adds that, listen, if you look at the text of the Torah, Avraham Avinu, he owned a slave, right? He interacted with people. You never find in the Torah that you have a responsibility of forcing others to release their slaves. We don't have that in Torah. And what he is basically saying is that the North has this attitude that it is as if their moral responsibility that slavery comes to an end in other areas and other territories. That's not the way of Torah. It's an aggression in his view. He becomes popular as a result, and he gets a position in New Orleans. So he is in New Orleans from 1861 to 1865. During that period of time, he deals with a lot of fascinating issues. So number one, they note that when he arrived there in New Orleans, on his first sukkahs, he was the only sukkah in town. A year later, I think they said there were 40 of them. Kosher eaters. At the time, he was one of the few people, maybe they mentioned 4 families, and then over the next few years he is there are dozens of people that adapt kosher as well. Now, it was a very interesting thing that he had a significant impact there. He obviously attracted people because he had the knowledge, meaning many of the people who arrived in the Americas were people who knew, who recognized that the American rabbis, the ones that they dealt with at the time, were not the greatest scholars. And here you actually had a Torah scholar. Now, he had a lot of issues as a result of the Civil War, because as the North was closing in on New Orleans, so many people who lived in smaller areas that were not protected, they made their way to New Orleans. And they come to him, and they say, we had a child, we would like him to have a bris milah. So he says, okay, who's the mother? The mother was not Jewish, but she's okay with the bris milah. So he responds, okay, if you want me to convert the child, that is fine. So you could go ahead and could have a bris milah, but then we take the child to a mikveh as well. And they said, no, the mother would never allow the child to be baptized as a Jew. Meaning, we're okay with the circumcision, but to baptize him as a Jew, that not. This is a reality that is occurring. So he said absolutely not. So there was a moel in town, and the moel charged a lot of money, and these are difficult times. So for him, rejecting circumcision, It's a parnasa. So the Moel, by the last name of Goldenberg, it's recorded, Mr. Goldenberg. Mr. Goldenberg was very upset at Rabbi Ilui, and he sends the question to Europe, to European Rabbanim, that the local rabbi is making this new halacha that you are not allowed to circumcise children when the mother is not Jewish, when we know very well, right, throughout history, we have converted children, we have been performing circumcision. So he sent the question with leaving out a few details, and obviously if you leave out the right details and you send it to the right person, you're going to get yourself a psak that works well for you. And bingo, mission accomplished, Mr. Goldenberg. The Moel Goldenberg gets it from one of the rabbis in Europe, claiming that Rabbi Ilui made a mistake, and this made a major to-do. This was a major to-do that he had to deal with the pressure in New Orleans, with the issues themselves. After the war, he made his way to Cincinnati, and it's interesting to know because Cincinnati at the time was the hub of Reform Judaism, because the Hebrew Union College was situated there. I think now they have a branch in New York, but they still have a presence in Cincinnati. But he opened a traditional shul there, and he's buried in Cincinnati. When we used to drive through, I always had a desire to stop by, to visit the caver of a person, right, that was one of the first great Torah scholars in North America itself. Now, as they were struggling with this issue of slavery itself, one of the writers at the time knows that it is important to remember that when you read Jewish law, there is a difference between what you could call ideal law, or a law that is given based on circumstances. Meaning, there are laws that when you read in the Torah law that there is a mitzvah to go ahead and eat a specific food at a specific time. This is an ideal law. It is something that it is an ideal. Torah wants you to do it. It will teach you values. This is something that was relevant then, relevant for all times. Then there are laws that were given, not because they are ideals, but due to the fact that there were circumstances. The Torah has to be given to a society, and it has to relate to what is existent at that time. In other words, slavery, he tells us. Don't think that the Torah wants slavery, but rather it existed at that time. People were going to do it anyway. So laws, regulations were given that it should be done in a proper way. Regulations were given. This is how you treat the Hebrew slave. This is how you treat the non-Jewish slave. But obviously this is not an ideal. And he writes, I can prove to you, look at the Torah. The Torah talks about polygamy. Are you going to tell me that that's an ideal, that the fellow should be walking around with 4 wives? Obviously not. Obviously not. Obviously what the Torah is telling you is that it is something that existed at that time. So the Torah tells you that if you do have 4, well, it's a reality, and you should know that you have responsibility to all 4 of them. This is what the Torah wants. Never view the text of the Torah as something that should be waived. And he was trying to make his claim that we have to be very careful when there are those getting up, pointing to the Bible, and this is the Americas of the 1860s, when everyone was pointing to the Bible, Jews and Christians alike, that, hey, slavery existed then, it is something that is ethical because it's in the book of ethics. The Jews were waving their Bible. Even Donald Trump loves the Bible because he knows that you're not going to get votes if you don't love the Bible. He can't quote anything from it, but the reality is that you have to love the Bible. They point to the Bible. So this Jewish thinker was the first one that presents something that it is very much accepted today. Don't go ahead and read a text without understanding the environment that existed. This is something that the Rambam already indicates regarding korbanot. Korbanot are not this ideal. It's a reality that exists. The Torah gives us laws, regulations, how to address that reality. This is something that we are told. Slavery is fascinating because it starts off with our personal history as a Jewish nation. It continues to the challenge we read about in the Haftorah, and it is a challenge that even in the Americas in the 1860s they were addressed. It was an issue that was popular at the time, but hopefully we at least gain a little bit of the big picture of what Avdut is all about. Thank you for coming, and we see you B'ezrat Hashem next week.